host, Jordan Bingham. Today's show is about building an international space economy, what it is, what's needed, and what's next. We will hear from Alex MacDonald, Chief Economist at NASA, and Nicolas Peter from the International Space University's Space Policy and Entrepreneurship Lab. Let's go over to Jamie Morin, Executive Director of Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy, to get us started.
Thank you, Jordan. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Space Policy Show. We are delighted to have both Alex and Nicolas with us today. And we're going to talk about the critical issue of the future of the space economy. It's on a lot of people's minds right now, and it's an issue that is perhaps still maybe a bit misunderstood. Let me start, if I can, gentlemen, and ask you each to just tell us a little bit about your current work, your current research, and the organizations that where you're helping to shape the future of space and the space economy. Alex, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here. I was reflecting earlier this week, actually. This is my 15th year at NASA. And I started out as a contractor and then became a research professor and then entered into an agreement with NASA from the university I was at to serve as a manager, and really kind of eventually wound up here at NASA headquarters where I serve as the chief economist. And over the course of that 15 years, led a few programs, including the old emerging space office that was dedicated to economic analysis related to commercial space companies. And then most recently was program executive for the International Space Station's National Lab. And these days really spend a lot of my time working with the Office of the Administrator team as a whole on really the whole portfolio that NASA as a $25 billion agency engages with, which includes everything from, of course, the original aeronautics, all the way to, of course, climate change here on Earth, and of course our strategy for returning to the moon and eventually getting onto Mars, as well as, of course, an area that I have a lot of interest in and have worked a lot in, which is our commercialization of low Earth orbit. So it's a broad portfolio that we have here at NASA, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the ways in which NASA has been shaping the space economy.
And Nicolas, you're teaching now at the International Space University, and I know the student body there is always interested in how space is transforming, the space economy is growing, but you've also been at National Space Agency, DLR, and been part of the European space institutions. Tell us about your work and your research and where you see that heading in the next year.
Yes, so thank you, Jamie, for the question. Hello, Alex. Great to be here today to be able to exchange with you on the topic. So I'm at ISU, the sole university dedicated to space in the world since 35 years. So I'm speaking you from Europe, from across the pond. So I'm based in Strasbourg, France, where we have our headquarters, and where I'm serving as a professor of space policy and international affairs, seconded by ESA, the European Space Agency. And in that context, I'm in charge of all space policy, economics, and law activities across our programs. So it's not only about education, but also I'm heading the Space Policy and Entrepreneurship Lab that is really trying to look at the changing space context. What are the trends? What are the drivers to be able to distinguish between the signal and the noise, to really see what matters and try to bring in the same place the practitioner experience as well as the more academic perspective, trying really to devise actionable policies and recommendations that we can put into motion to make sure that the space economy is growing worldwide.
So that brings us to probably an important question of terminology. We've got a lot of people use the phrase space economy, and sometimes they use it to mean different things. Some people envision extraction of resources on extraterrestrial bodies, in situ resource utilization for settlement. and others are thinking about direct TV, satellite television. When you guys think about the space economy, how do you define it for yourselves and for the purposes of your research?
It's almost the 1 trillion question in the sector, because indeed everyone has his own definition, and we know that what matters are the definition. And we really see that different people try to come up with different numbers, because that's what's behind all of this body of research. And most of the time, the methodology is very opaque. And we have certain shortcomings that make it difficult to first size the economy, because we do not look with the same lens at the same issues. Because all the studies that have been done, most of the time, they have done with a purpose. So that's put in the system a bias that may lead to different issues. And the other one, and maybe Alex will talk about that, we have an issue with data gathering, because in all official classification, you don't have a space classification in the official statistics that make it very difficult to have comparable figures. And I'm not talking about only different fiscal years or exchange currency fluctuation from year to year, but it's very complex. It's very difficult. So I'm really glad you bringing that the question, because it's something important.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd say that one of the really interesting things about the space economy is that we don't know exactly how large it is, but what we do know is that it is large enough that we're not exactly sure how to count it all. And one of the reasons that it's so large is that it is much more than our space agency expenditures, which of course in the US includes NASA, but also includes military space agencies. Our National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration also has space satellites for its missions. But there really is also this huge market for, of course, direct TV, satellite TV, and it's hard to measure exactly how many terrestrial antennas are sold, and some of them are kind of actually made in kind of domestic markets that are not fully tracked. So it's kind of fascinating that we actually have so much economic activity, going off in the world that we don't exactly know how to measure it. I would say the two organizations that put out the most consistent measurements of the overall space economy are the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. They've got a very robust program that looks at the global space economy and regularly produces some of the most kind of interesting comparative calculations of the global space economy. And then here in the US, the Space Foundation produces a pretty regular estimate of the size of the space economy that includes the government sectors and the commercial sectors. And as I'm sure many of your listeners know, the commercial space sector, which is dominated by communications satellites, historically predominantly in geosynchronous orbit, but increasingly in low Earth orbit and MEO orbits as well. That really is the majority. And so there really is a data collection challenge, as was mentioned, in really getting that all together. Increasingly, because there's been a lot of private sector interest in the space economy. Now banks have started putting out their own projections of the space economy. But that's very different than actually measuring the current economic activity that's going on. For example, even at NASA, only last year did we put out our first ever economic impact estimate of the agency as a whole. It was the first time we ever did a classic input-output model for you real economics wonks out there, and estimated the overall economic impact of the agency. So, space economics writ large is a really interesting area because we're really at the beginning, I would say, of establishing kind of the global kind of standards for measuring the space economy. There's still lots of debates around it, and it's going to be really interesting as it evolves, obviously, for the next few decades here and maybe even longer.
Well, speaking of that evolution, Alex, governments in general, some limited exceptions, but in general, governments want to have thriving economies and are willing to make investments and are seeking forward-looking policy so that they can achieve that. A strong economy is, kind of foundational for many of the other things that political leaders might want to do. And there's plenty of terrestrial examples of how nations have made far-sighted investments in infrastructure or education or environmental sustainability that will, generate advantages to their societies over the very long run. As we look to an expanding space economy, I would be interested in understanding what each of you think of as the key future investments that nations are or should be looking at. And that, again, that is both the space economy measured in terms of terrestrial consumption of data through space, but also the more speculative, long-term potential orbital economy and beyond Earth orbit economy. What are the big investments for the future that nations are or should be thinking about today? Would you like to kick us off, Nicolas?
So it's a good question, but I think it needs to be put into a context, because all different countries, and we have about 80 countries now investing more than 10 million a year in space at the governmental level. So we really see an internationalization and globalization of space activities, because it's spread from north to south, east to west, irrespective where you are in the world map. But it really shows that there are different strategies, and you have the legacy players like in the US, like in Europe, in Japan, and so on. But you also have newcomers that decide to invest into space for different reasons, different political motives. But you also have disruptors that really try to have ambition goals, such as having science mission or exploration, like the UAE, that really want to position themselves in the region, while other one might just be more pragmatic and having utilitarian approaches. And that really put them in a different trajectory in terms of development. And therefore, they need their local ecosystem, because that's another term we can discuss about is the space ecosystem. Because if we use that, I would say then there are different ecological niches, and that where every country derive its own policy to achieve its own political motives. And those can be internally driven or externally driven, but that really put them in different situations with respect to space activities. But what is also important for the newcomers in the sector is that you don't need to necessarily develop all the infrastructure as you want, as you needed like maybe 15 years ago. Now there are different ways to access space. You can have space as a service, ground station as a service. So there are different ways for people to jump in the space sector, and that make it way more agile. So in fact, for many countries, they can really leverage the marketplace to be able to develop their capabilities and learn about it and provide benefits for their citizens. So it's very difficult to have a short answer to the question, because it's really country specific.
Are there areas where you're seeing particular focuses and investment?
In terms of public investments, indeed. Just maybe for the audience to understand the European complexity, we have the European Commission that is representing the European Union, 27 member states. You have the European Space Agency that is 22 member states. So in total, just with these two organizations, you have 30 different states that are party to one or the two. So, and then you have also national space agencies, and in particular in the historical space players, that make it very difficult to see who is doing what. But there's a lot of synergies between the investment done at different levels. But right now the topic is into developing public-driven infrastructure, or at least infrastructure that provide this type of data infrastructure. That could be Earth observation with the Copernicus program, Galileo, which is the equivalent of the GPS system, or the future secure satellite connectivity system that has been proposed by the European Commission that aims to be a multi-orbit constellation. So those are the different building blocks upon which different players can then either help developing the infrastructure or, as you mentioned, since we are moving into a data economy, to be able to leverage those different systems to create value-added systems.
No, thank you. Alex, as you look at NASA's focus and the U.S. more broadly, what do you think are the key investments that are on the table?
Yeah, I would say there's kind of four that really come to mind in terms of the big picture opportunities that are are in front of the world. Really, obviously, one of the best ways to predict the future is to look at the past and see what's happened in the past and see what's going on today. And today, communications is still the main source of commercial revenue in the space economy. And actually, when you see what investments are being made today by commercial companies, it's not actually predominantly new sectors. It's predominantly new ways of serving the communications market. It's in satellite internet. And I think that's really going to be a major area going forward, provided that the technology kind of delivers on some of the promises. Certainly for those who've been watching the space, so to speak, for a long time, folks will remember the 1990s and the Teledesic constellation and the Iridium constellation that made many similar promises, some of which came to pass, many of which did not. And so, it's an area that is going to probably continue to evolve. But there's really no question that the globe is becoming more interconnected, and space really is core infrastructure for connecting the world's people, the world's economies, and communications, I think, is really going to be a key area for continued investment. I think the second really important one that I think is going to be a little bit new is going to be in not just Earth observation, which there's been a very significant market in for quite some time, but really in some new applications related to climate change. One of the new technologies that really is still in the tech demo area right now, but it's the ability to observe greenhouse gas emissions at potentially point sources. And this is a potentially really important tool if the world is really going to think about getting to some sort of net zero level of greenhouse gas emissions overall. Because one of the things that I've often kind of asked, kind of somewhat provocatively, is if we ever did reach net zero with our current systems, how would we even know it? Because currently estimates of emissions rely on often self-reporting, and these things are, let's just say, inconsistent. But technologies are emerging, and there are a number of companies and nonprofits that are actually now moving into this space that, with capabilities to try and identify point source emissions for both methane and CO2. A long way to go on that, but at a global level, that could become deeply important. And the last kind of two ones that I want to mention as areas of investment are some of the ones that we, of course, I think are often most excited about, right? Human spaceflight related. Obviously at NASA, we're entering a new phase where we're looking really at now, in the kind of 2030 timeframe, shifting to commercial space stations. And that's an incredible opportunity around the world. And there's a lot of complexity in it. But there's no question that with the success of Commercial Crew, we are now seeing types of missions that we've never seen before. Privately funded missions like Inspiration 4, but there's going to be others coming down the road. We have first private astronaut mission from Axiom coming up to the International Space Station in the not too distant future. So there's really a lot of potential in that area. And as the cost of human spaceflight access goes down, there will be more potential in that. And finally, obviously have to hit on what I think is a really important area, obviously for the U.S., but for the world, which is, of course, investments in not just return to the moon, but return to the moon to stay and to stay with our international partners. For me, there's really no question that we are going to be returning to the moon here over the course of the next few years here robotically, and then returning to the moon with humans in the not too distant future. And I think this time, because of the changes that we've seen in the economics of launch, and because really space is a much more global industry than it was in the 1960s when we first went to the moon, I really do think that we are going to be returning to the moon to stay, and I think we want that to be as international, as participatory as possible, because I think we really want to be ensuring that we're returning there, as we promised we would in 1972 with peace and hope for all humankind. And that we intend to conduct peaceful activities there of scientific research, potentially economic activities, but really learning to live and work together on the moon in preparation for even going further. So I think those are 4 big areas, and a lot of change is going to come in each of them.
But Jamie, maybe just one point to react. Sorry, on Alex, I fully agree that with the points that have been mentioned, but the one on the link between space and climate change. This one can really be a game changer for certain activities, because space can help to monitor climate change, to mitigate the impact, but also space will be impacted by ESG financing. So it can help to monitor the commercial investment done by other verticals, other sectors, because we can monitor if they're really doing all what they say or they claim they're doing. So when they do the reporting for the where the company is on the stock market or being rated in terms of ESG standards, space can be one of the sources to be able to monitor that. But so this is very important, because we always say we want to bring space closer to finance, but we need to bring also finance closer to space. So it's 2 different communities. There's a lot of legwork to be done. But I think that's going to be very important. And in Europe, politically, it's the most important topic is how to do this green transition, green and digital transition. And that's why the European Space Agency is looking at Space for Green Future initiative that really aim to be able to provide specific analytics, specific tools, such as digital twins of the Earth system to model. So that means to provide like a modeling tool, if you change certain parameters, how this impact the overall system, because we are really moving to a more digital world, and we need to be able to understand what it means. What does it mean to have, if we have more emissions? We need to anticipate what are the consequences, not only for the ice cap, that's very important, but that will impact at local level with more natural disaster. So you need to be able to build more resilient cities. And all of that needs, space takes time, but if you to change the society and adapt earthly infrastructure, it takes a lot of time. And you need as well to be able to fast forward in the future by modelization. And that's the thing, that where space is the only true element that can help into that, because all the data we're gathering is retrospective. So space can also help to test, validate the models, and go faster into the prediction. So that's very important.
I very much agree.
The topic of monitoring and enforcement of environmental standards and historically we've thought about that as a government role, but we now know with the rise of the ESG standards and focus on social responsibility among corporate entities, there's actually a broader market for that insight, right? To see if people are living up to what they've said they would do. And with monetization of some of these markets in trading of emissions credits and the like, again, monitoring becomes an activity of economic importance in and of itself. My colleague Karen Jones did some nice work 3 or 4 years ago about a multi-layer strategy for this, where space doesn't necessarily have to get down to finally resolving point sources of emissions, but cues other sensors to know where to look. It's a big Earth, and drilling down, perhaps space, then airborne, then terrestrial, can offer some real advantages. Those things are all, in a sense, both services and infrastructure. Right? They provide a framework for economic activity. Are there other kind of critical enabling services or infrastructures that it makes sense for governments either to make key investments in upfront in order to enable big things to happen, or to at least set the policy framework that allows these things to develop? I mean, as we look to the future, what are we going to regret not doing today when we look back at ourselves 20 years hence?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one of the enabling pieces that's going to be important as we see more traffic in space is going to be, eventually things like space traffic management. We've been able to kind of get away so far because we've had a relatively low amount of activity, and we've had predominantly nation-state actors. But as we go forward, really the barriers to access are dropping in very real ways right now, and they may drop even more significantly in the future. And that's going to create a really different scenario than we've been working with thus far. And NASA certainly tried to identify the need for greater national collaboration on this through the Artemis Accords, which predominantly pertain to lunar cooperation, but they're also really fundamentally about our overall cooperation and rules of the road for peaceful use of space in general. Because I think we're increasingly seeing that there are scenarios where the low Earth orbit environment could become, if not economically unusable, then certainly prohibitively expensive if we end up with a significant amount of debris. And obviously, some of the sources for potential debris events come from simply extensive use, but there's also other activities. If you start to have propellant depots in the Earth orbit, well, those are very significant potential sources of debris if anything goes wrong. And needless to say, any sort of kinetic warfare activity in space has the potential to really fundamentally undermine and potentially preclude really productive economic activity in space. And I think that's becoming an increasing concern of space agencies and the space community writ large at this time. It's been a rising concern. And I think if we don't make the types of investments that aren't just financial investments, or investments in our time, political investments to address this issue, I think if we don't make those investments now, I think there's a decent chance we'll regret not doing so later.
Alex, not to get too economics geeky here for our audience or even ourselves, but the one of the lessons in economic study of collective human activity is that we tend to have really high discount rates as we look to future benefits and costs, right? We value things today way more highly than we value things in the future. And once you get several years out, that really shapes behavior. When we think about something like a Kessler syndrome of growing debris on orbit, to take the space example, that's something that plays out over decades, not weeks, months, or years. Do you have any thoughts of how we can, as an economist, how we can avoid making really serious mistakes, how we can incentivize people to think in the long term and somehow reduce those discount rates so that the future is more important in people's benefit calculations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting macro global economy challenge because, discount rates are effectively set by, kind of global interest rates and expected rates of return, right? And expected rates of technological change in these things. And so it's very hard to kind of have a different discount rate than essentially the global financial community, right? Inherently.
Yeah.
And I think kind of the base minimum is knowing that, right? Knowing that inherently there's a bias in the global financial system to essentially a discount rate that discounts, the cost of activities that may happen 25 years down the road, right? And there's a lot of different work, and it's been very much in the climate community that's actually been pioneering a lot of this work, right? In working with different discount rates. And there really may be something that we in the space industry, and particularly in the low Earth orbit environment, can learn from that community, learn from that economics community as to how they've been dealing with that. But I think actually the core foundational challenge we need to get across in our community is, first of all, getting our leadership to understand that that is the case here, right? That we do have a challenge with that. Because we can come up with as many different discount rates and papers and panels as we want, unless people really know that they need to be thinking about that and making decisions based on different discount rates, that's not going to matter. So for me, I think it's really, recognizing that we're in a very different space regime in low Earth orbit, particularly now with new space access, with new space players, than we have been in the past. And that we really do need to put our heads together internationally. Maybe it's very similar ways to, what we did in the 60s, where we really engaged in multilateral forums with the UN to come to new agreements on how we're going to behave in space. I don't say that lightly, right? That's not an easy task, right? We'll all lose even more hair by the end of that process, right? But it may be a deeply important one, right? And I'd argue that we've now reached the point in the economic development of space and the accessibility of space where we really do need to be thinking about these things in new ways. Discount rates are important. Economic analysis can really help us, but it really is a political commitment to addressing this issue and recognizing we have an issue coming here.
European leaders have, I think, historically, and maybe it's because you tend to have more than a couple centuries of national history to point to. You've tended to have more focus on the long term, on building institutional and legal foundations, on these kinds of problem sets. What are the insights that are not entirely, but mostly American audience for this episode should be taking from these conversations that are going on among European thought leaders like yourself and political leaders who are trying to make decisions about things like space traffic management?
So that's very timely. We in Europe we look into that. We are very much concerned, and there is an initiative that has been proposed last month, 15th of February, by European Commissioner Thierry Breton to put forward a reflection on the need for a space traffic management system in Europe that will be looking at this question. But I think one of the main important issues is to put space into perspective. But I think we need to communicate better what is at stake. For instance, a few numbers. There have been about 12,000 satellite launched since Sputnik 1 over 65 years. And out of these 12,000, about 10% were just launched last year. And last year topped the previous year that by 30%. So we really see like an amazing amount of new satellite being launched. And we also see its constellation, but not only, because we also saw last year the record of the launch attempt worldwide being beaten. And the previous record was from 1967. So that means in the height of the Cold War, we are beyond this point. Is it a tipping point? I don't know, but it's simply show that we are seeing a massive trend of assets being sent into space. And one of the most important issues that I think people in Europe but worldwide needs to understand is that space is an environment per se, with the resources being limited. And then you have the traditional Jefferson paradox, where in economy, where you see that if there are technological progresses, you could have more efficient use of the space, of these resources, but those lead to, instead of using less of those, to use more of those. And as Alex mentioned, with the barrier of entry into space being lowered, you can see that now more players are being active, and that's putting a lot of tension into the system, because its space is big. There's a lot of space into space, but it's still finite in a certain number of things in terms of orbits you can use, especially if you're talking about LEO, and in frequency telecommunication system. And why is it important? We are moving from the old system where, if you compare that to the transport system, you had cars in space. We were sending big cars, big satellite in a specific orbit, but it was one, and we were happy if we had a series of 3 or 4 in the same orbit. Now we are building highways into space. So we are moving from cars, individual cars, to highways with hundreds of cars in the same highways, but we are building multiple highways. So that's why it's very important. We need to take that into account. And there are risks of interference, and there are discussion at the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So we really need to explain to decision makers that we need to protect the space environment if we want for today and in the future to be able to have our kids being able to use space and benefit from that. Because if we have a day without space, now the consequences are dramatic. Some economic analysis says that in the US, one day without GPS costs $1 billion to the US economy alone. So if people really understand that you need to develop the infrastructure, you need to be safe and secure, it's important. But in space traffic management, there is an issue for me with the M. What we need first is space traffic awareness, because the management implies that someone is in there to be able to enforce or to tell you not to do something. And we are not there yet. That's why, talking about, we need to know what's going on, because we're moving to the Anthropocene, and space is one of the examples into that. So we really need to be able to have all the system in place, and we need to change, as Alex said, we need also to change the mindset.
Let me ask you guys to think even broader. If we revisit this show again in like 20 years, and we are in a world with a thriving, vibrant, global space economy. By global, I mean nations around the world participating in an economy that is both beyond the Earth's surface and space enabled on the Earth's surface. What does our world look like? What is there? What can people expect if we get this stuff right, and space makes an even bigger contribution to human well-being 20 years from now? If you have a science fiction movie to reference, that's fine. But if you want to write the script and we can produce it later ourselves, that'd be great too. Alex, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and it's a fun one. When I think about science fiction movies and space, I often think about the dueling visions of the future presented by Star Trek and by Dune. You have a future where people peacefully cooperate for scientific purposes and to explore the unknown. You've got a future where the great houses in Dune compete for the control of spice and have a lot of palace intrigue. And of course, those are fictional stories, and the reality, isn't an either or. It may be, it probably will be a bit of both. And I think those are important things to think about, and remember that we're all still the actors, kind of writing the future that we're going to live, especially those of us who participate in the space industry, and really anyone who wants to participate in the space industry increasingly can, which is a really important point to know. I think a few of the things that if we get it right that we'll see is using space systems fundamentally to help mitigate the challenges of climate change. At this point, as the latest reports from the IPCC make it clear, we're in for significant changes regardless. And space systems and Earth observation systems, including carbon dioxide and methane monitoring systems, but also just simply Earth science missions and systems that can help communities predict where flooding is going to be happening, the types of risks that different communities are going to be facing. I think these are really important systems that will, if we get things right, will help us navigate the few decades ahead. On an optimistic side, I think we're also going to be seeing a world where hopefully the nations of the world will be living and working together on the moon. That we're going to see the moon become not a place for new conflict, but a place where the nations of the world, like we have been able to do in Leo thus far, are going to work together to leave behind some of the challenges that we know internationally we have had in the past, and hopefully learn more about ourselves and about our ability to work together as a world on the moon. I think if we get it right, that's the future we'll see there, and we'll be on the moon in a hopefully even continuous fashion with different people from different nations at different times. And finally, the one that I think we haven't really touched on here is that one of the great things about having new capabilities emerge and having private sector capabilities emerge that don't necessarily rely on government missions and government programs is that we're going to see individuals and groups of individuals undertake missions, human spaceflight missions, that are very exciting and very different than what we may expect or have seen from space agencies in the past. And one of my favorite thought-provoking ones that I like to always bring up is the potential for a first human mission to fly by Venus. A lot of the first planetary missions that were sent out were actually first to Venus because it's closer. It only takes about a year to go and fly around Venus and come back, whereas a Mars mission is in the 2 to 3 year category, depending on what kind of propulsion system you want to believe exists at that time. And while it may not make sense for a space agency to lead that mission, if the costs are low enough, groups of individuals may be able to undertake that mission themselves. And I think that's a really exciting future. It's a future that's very diverse in terms of the types of human spaceflight experiences that humans both have and then share with the world. And there may be a lot that we learn from that. So I think those are three things that if we get it right, hopefully space will be able to contribute to human well-being and experience.
I'm hearing that Alex might be buying a ticket on that Venusian expedition is what I'm taking away here. How about you, Nicolas?
Yeah, it's a good question, because in terms of different ways, if what I see coming up, or I would like to see coming up very soon, is being able to monitor the Earth 24/7 with live videos. I know it's up to the horizon, but that would be very important to really take the pulse of the planet Earth. So that's something that we could have this coverage the same way. You go on the channel to be able to watch the weather. You have the weather channel, but to be able to see the spaceship Earth, because we're all astronauts on the same spaceship, to be able to see how it's going, but in a simple way. The other one would be to use with your regular cell phone being linked to satellite communication. And if you remember, when the cell phone revolution started, we were talking about certain number of minutes you were in your subscription plan. Then you had roaming charges, and now, at least in Europe, you only have voice and data, and you have an amount of data you have to download. But maybe with the future networks, this will not exist anymore. There will be no roaming charge as well, because you will be all the time connected and be able to receive data. One of the other things is Alex mentioned is space exploration. And that's where I'm gonna because you asked about potential science fiction inspiration. I will quote one that it's by Andy Weir, but I will not quote The Martian. I will use the book Artemis. That, funny enough, was published 2 years before the Artemis Artemis program on the NASA side came. So I don't know who influenced whom, because it's to be set in 2080 on the moon, where Artemis is the name of the only city on the moon, where a very cosmopolitan, multi-diverse society, where you have different players on board, and the intrigue is about in situ resource utilization. And I find it very interesting, because it tried to really, in a similar way that The Martian did it, but to look into the future with real constraints about people living in space, living on the moon. And hopefully the movie will come out very soon, in the next 2 to 3 years. I know they've signed a deal, so we'll see if that comes out. But that could be something important if you had the same impact as Andy's movie, The Martian. The other one is, unfortunately, Gravity. It hit the theaters. It's pretty old, but I think people now think it's fiction or science fiction, but it can happen very soon. We've seen that. We had ASAT tests or anti-satellite tests, but we have also impact of satellite or part of different spacecraft hitting other ones. that can lead to dramatic consequences. So gravity, unfortunately, is for the science fiction is less. It's less funny. But it's something worth still keeping in mind.
Yeah, certainly one of the items that could knock us off that sunnier future that we were exploring there if we don't get it right. Well, before we wrap up for the day, I wondered, any closing thoughts for our audience about the space economy or the future of human accomplishment in the domain?
No, I'd just like to say it's been a pleasure to chat with you both, and for anyone listening or watching, there really never has been a better time to get involved with the space economy and space policy. There's an incredible amount happening. There's a lot at stake, and we hope to have you participating and be part of this future. It's going to be exciting and it's going to be challenging.
Thank you, Alex. Nicolas?
Yes, to echo what Alex just said, it has never been better being involved in the space sector. 2021 was breaking a lot of the records, being in the number of satellite launch of rockets. We have exciting missions across the solar system. We are on Moon, on Mars, in Leo. We have bold plans, so it's very good. And we need also the enthusiasm of the new generation, the new space generation, to be able to involve into that, to make sure that the prediction we have about the $1 trillion space economy by 2030, 2040 will come to life. So we really count on the younger generation, on young professionals to get involved, and hopefully also to tell us we were wrong and they did it better.
Well, always better is certainly what we're hoping for. It has been a great pleasure having both of you with us on the show today, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how our conversation holds up to the test of time. Thanks to the audience for joining us for another episode of the Space Policy Show. It's back to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Jamie, for leading that discussion. This topic really speaks to the exciting future of space enterprise and what still needs to happen. And thank you to our guest. Our executive producer is Colleen Stover, and our technical director is James Liggins. You can find more of our shows at csps.aerospace.org, and check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow. See you next time.